There are towns across Canada that are quietly, silently vanishing. Not all at once, but slowly, methodically, like the fading of a ghost. You pass them on the highway and barely notice. A crumbling storefront here. An empty schoolhouse there. Over 20% of Canadian cities lost population between 2011 and 2016. Some of the most remote regions are experiencing even steeper declines. But here's what most Canadians don't realize. By 2030, some of these communities may cease to exist as we know them. Today, we're showing you the 10 Canadian towns sitting on the edge of oblivion. Before we journey into the fate of these forgotten corners of Canada, hit that subscribe button right now. This story deserves to be seen, and YouTube's algorithm is designed to reward channels like ours when you engage. So smash that like button, turn on notifications, and join our community of people who want to understand the hidden truths about the places around them. Let's dive in. Canada's heartland is experiencing a silent exodus that few are talking about. According to demographic projections, rural Newfoundland and Labrador is expected to see population declines of 19.3% by 2025, while Ontario faces a 17.2% reduction in rural populations. These aren't small fluctuations. They represent the systematic abandonment of entire regions. The root cause traces back to what economists call the Staples thesis. Canadian towns were built around single industries. Wheat on the prairies, cod in the Maritimes, timber in the forests, copper in the mountains. When those industries collapsed, whether through market forces, resource depletion, or industrial automation, the towns collapsed with them. What makes this crisis particularly haunting is the ripple effect. When young people leave, they don't return. Schools close. Hospitals lose staff. Grocery stores shut down. Infrastructure crumbles. One rural doctor put it bluntly, once you lose something in a small town, you never get it back. The irony is devastating. While Canada's major metropolitan centers boom with immigration and growth, these rural communities are starved of investment and opportunity. Over 80% of Canada's population now lives in urban centers, and that concentration is only intensifying. The towns we're about to show you aren't just experiencing decline, they're experiencing existential erasure. The Canadian prairies once represented limitless possibility. Towns like Rowley, Alberta, thrived with populations of 500 people in the early 1900s, sustained by agricultural prosperity and railway connections. Today, Rowley stands with only 8 to 12 residents. Walking down its main street is like walking through a museum of abandonment, restored churches and saloons telling stories nobody's there to listen to. But Rowley's situation isn't unique. Across Saskatchewan and Alberta, hundreds of similar communities are experiencing accelerated population hemorrhage. Nemiscum, founded in 1915, now has exactly 2 inhabitants. Flowerdale lost entire farming families during the Great Depression and never recovered, with residents leaving to pursue ranching elsewhere. The demographic data reveals the brutal pattern. Young people are fleeing prairie towns for urban centers, particularly Toronto, Vancouver, and Calgary. Those aged 25 to 40 constitute the backbone of any economy, and prairie towns are hemorrhaging them at alarming rates. Agricultural consolidation has dramatically reduced the number of farming families needed to work the land. What once required dozens of families now requires one industrial operation. Meanwhile, these towns offer minimal employment diversity, aging infrastructure, and limited educational opportunities. The machinery of rural depopulation feeds itself. As people leave, services disappear. As services disappear, more people leave. Insinger, Saskatchewan, offers a chilling example. From a peak of 100 residents, the population dropped to 20 by the turn of the century, with most remaining buildings now boarded up despite fresh paint attempts to hide the decay. The story of maritime decline is perhaps the most dramatic in Canadian history. In 1992, Canada implemented a moratorium on cod fishing, the biggest layoff in Canadian history. One decision, one moment, and an entire way of life evaporated. Fishing communities that had sustained themselves for centuries were suddenly rendered economically obsolete. Isle Bonaventure, in Quebec, served as a thriving hub of the French cod fishery and later the Jersey fishing industry for generations. By 1967, it had 0 year-round residents. Today it's a national park, a monument to what was lost. The government eventually expropriated remaining properties, converting the human tragedy into a tourist attraction. Newfoundland and Labrador bore the brunt of this collapse most severely. Entire regions that depended exclusively on fish stocks faced instantaneous economic death. Workers from these maritime communities then migrated west to resource extraction industries like oil in Fort McMurray, following the pattern Innes described of chasing staple commodities across a desperate geography. The haunting reality is that these communities can't simply reinvent themselves overnight. A fishing town without fish doesn't magically become a tech hub. The skills, the infrastructure, the culture, everything is built around extraction of a single resource. When that resource disappears, the entire foundation collapses. Spring Hill, Nova Scotia, attempted this transformation, successfully converting its abandoned coal mines into a geothermal energy source. But such success stories are exceptions, not the rule. For every Spring Hill, there are dozens of maritime towns still waiting for salvation that may never arrive. Before Canada was defined by oil, it was defined by mining. Entire communities rose from wilderness to serve the insatiable demand for metals and minerals. Eneox, British Columbia, was once a thriving company town built around a massive copper smelter in the early 20th century. Mining camps and towns dotted the Canadian landscape, each one a boom-and-bust story waiting to unfold. Nicholson, Ontario, represented the lumber industry's promise, a town that supplied railway ties to the British Empire. When fire destroyed the mill, the economic death sentence was signed. The population dwindled through the late 1960s until the last resident left. Now only rusting machinery and deteriorating buildings remain, monuments to industrial ambition now reclaimed by forest and moss. The pattern across mining towns is depressingly consistent. Broughton, Nova Scotia, was intended as a company town to house up to 10,000 coal mining residents, a vision of unlimited prosperity. It never came close to that goal, and when the mining industry modernized and consolidated, even those few jobs disappeared. Elliott Lake, Ontario, managed a remarkable transformation by converting itself from a dying uranium mining town into a retirement community, attracting seniors seeking affordable housing and small-town living. But this requires specific conditions: a suitable climate, proximity to amenities, and extraordinary community effort. Without these factors, mining towns simply evaporate. The infrastructure they built was designed exclusively for extraction industries. When those industries migrate or disappear, there's nothing left. No economic foundation, no reason for companies to invest, no incentive for people to stay. The buildings remain as archaeological evidence of human ambition, slowly consumed by nature. The crisis runs deeper than simple population loss. It's about who's leaving. Young families are abandoning rural towns en masse while older residents remain, creating a demographic catastrophe that will accelerate community collapse by 2030. A town with a median age of 60 cannot sustain itself. There are no young workers to maintain infrastructure. There are no young families to fill schools. There are no entrepreneurs launching new businesses. Instead, communities face spiraling healthcare costs, insufficient tax bases to maintain roads and utilities, and the constant terror that essential services might disappear entirely. In some remote Canadian communities, ambulances are parked hours away, meaning a heart attack becomes a death sentence not from medical inability but from geography. The opioid crisis has catastrophically worsened rural decline, hitting small towns with ferocity that urban centers with sophisticated medical infrastructure can partially absorb. Rural regions lack addiction treatment facilities, mental health services, and emergency response networks. Young people facing addiction often leave for cities seeking help or simply to escape the isolation. Meanwhile, systemic issues like racial discrimination against indigenous communities compound the exodus. First Nations members seeking employment in small towns encounter barriers that make staying economically irrational. The result is a vicious cycle. As young people leave, tax revenue shrinks, as tax revenue shrinks, services deteriorate. As services deteriorate, more people leave. By 2030, dozens of Canadian small towns will have crossed a threshold from which recovery becomes mathematically impossible. Once a community's population falls below critical mass, estimates suggest around 2,000 to 3,000 residents, maintaining basic infrastructure becomes unsustainable, and the town essentially ceases to function as a living community. Some Canadian small towns are already approaching the point of no return. Togo, Manitoba, exists with a population of 86. Canuck, located just north of the U.S. border in Saskatchewan, has 0 residents, a town that exists only in name and abandoned structures. Dorothy, Alberta, technically has a handful of residents but is surrounded by abandoned buildings that serve as a graveyard of its former prosperity. These aren't hypothetical scenarios or pessimistic projections, they're current realities. The question is no longer whether these communities will disappear, but when and what happens to the land, the buildings, and the historical memory they represent. A few communities have found pathways to survival, though these require exceptional circumstances. Warner, Alberta, population 383, created an all-girls hockey school that became nationally renowned, attracting families and investment. Cap-Lego, Quebec, exploited its microclimate to become known for lilacs. St. Gabriel Aylman bet its future on becoming an apple capital, launching an ambitious planting initiative. But these successes are exceptional precisely because they require the right combination of natural resources, visionary leadership, and community resources most struggling towns simply don't possess. For every success story, dozens of towns continue their slow fade into irrelevance. By 2030, the Canadian landscape will have fundamentally changed, with massive metropolitan cores surrounded by genuine wilderness, and the small towns that once connected them simply gone. The question that haunts us is this: what happens to the history, the culture, and the stories of communities that vanish? Do we let them disappear completely, or do we finally acknowledge that some parts of Canada deserve investment, opportunity, and a future worth staying for? This is the fate of rural Canada, a story most mainstream media won't touch because it's complicated, it's not sensational, and it requires acknowledging uncomfortable truths about inequality and urban concentration. But you watched this entire video, which means you care about understanding the real story behind the headlines. Subscribe to this channel for more deep dives into the hidden narratives shaping our world. Leave a comment below telling us which Canadian town's story affected you most, or share your own experience with rural communities. And please, hit that notification bell so you never miss our next investigation. Thank you for witnessing these forgotten places with us.